places are going very quickly. Now, today's event on protecting civil liberties in the nation is principally organized by the Intelligence Studies Project, but co-sponsored by the Strauss Center for International Security and Law, Clements Center for National Security, and also in its first year of operation, the Brumley National Security Fellows Program, Next Generation Fellows Program. And in that regard, this is largely a student-organized, student-directed event. So I'm going to introduce one of the members of the first cohort of Brumley Next Gen Graduating Fellows, Eric Manpearl, a student at the UT Law School and also here at the LBJ School. He'll introduce our guests. So anyway, enjoy yourselves. Feel free to come and go, get something more to eat, and promises will be fun. Eric, over to you.
So I'm Eric Manpearl. I'm a Brumley Fellow at the Intelligence Studies Project, as Professor Slick said. The privilege to introduce Alex Joel, who we're very excited to have here with us today. He's the Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And in that capacity, he reports directly to the Director of National Intelligence, General Clapper. And his responsibilities include ensuring the protection of privacy and civil liberties is appropriately incorporated into the intelligence community policies and procedures, and oversees compliance by the ODNI in privacy and civil liberties laws, reviewing complaints of possible abuses of privacy and civil liberties in programs and operations administered by the ODNI, and ensuring that the use of technology sustains and does not erode our privacy. Mr. Joel has more than a decade of experience in technology, privacy, and national security law. He joined the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA's Office of General Counsel, following 9/11. I joined that office in 2002, and he provided legal advice on intelligence activities. He provided us with a great story this morning that when he was applying to CIA's Office of General Counsel, he called up to see if they received his resume, and John Rizzo picked up the phone and called him on in for an interview. So that's how he came to the CIA. And prior to joining government, Mr. Joel served as the privacy, technology, and e-commerce attorney for Marriott International Incorporated, and he helped to establish and implement Marriott's global privacy compliance program, including Marriott's first privacy officer position. So he has a great wealth of experience in privacy law and technology issues, which he's utilizing at ODNI. And he received his law degree from the University of Michigan, and before that received his BA from Princeton University. So very happy to have Alex Joel here with us.
Great, thank you, Eric. Thank you very much. And if that bio sounded a little legalistic, some of the things that you were reading are actually legalistic. They're in the statute establishing this position. So I'm the Civil Liberties Protection Officer for the DNI, as you just heard from Eric. And I've held this position since stand-up of the ODNI. Now, I know some of you have been involved with different of these programs, and so you are familiar with the intelligence community and the Director of National Intelligence, but for those of you who may not be as familiar with it, I'll just pause for a couple of minutes to just quickly describe it. So we have, officially there are 17 elements of the intelligence community. We call them elements because some of them are offices within larger departments, and some of them are standalone agencies. So there are 17 elements. The ODNI is the 17th such element of the intelligence community. We were created in 2004 by Act of Congress, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004. And you know, this, if you just go back in history for a moment there, that was post 9/11. Actually, the WMD Commission, I think, had just finished its report or was still working on its report about the WMD situation in Iraq. And Congress was just getting around to finally considering the 9/11 Commission's recommendations about how to reform the intelligence community to prevent another 9/11 from happening. And they decided that the job of leading the intelligence community, which previously had been held, the listening device has fallen down. No, it's a bottle of water. Here we go. that the job that previously had been performed by the Director of Central Intelligence to both lead the CIA and lead the intelligence community was too much for one individual, one organization, so they took out the leadership of the intelligence community aspect of his job and put it in a new office called the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And when Congress created that office, they thought, well, it's important when we have this new organization with the authority and the responsibility to better coordinate the activities of all of our intelligence agencies, it's really important that there be somebody there to advise the director on privacy and civil liberties matters. And so they created this position called the Civil Liberties Protection Officer position, and they listed the duties of that position. You've heard some of those already. Basically, my job has been, since stand-up of the ODNI for the past 10 years, to work with the different directors of national intelligence, and there have been 4. The most recent one is Director Clapper, to work with him and with the other elements of the intelligence community, with offices of general counsel, offices of inspector general, policy folks, operators, analysts, and people outside of the intelligence community to figure out what policies we need to be to ensure that we have in place as the intelligence agencies conduct their activities in defense of the nation, to make sure we're adequately protecting people's privacy and civil liberties. And so, as I was mentioning at this session that we had this morning, it's certainly not a job and not a responsibility that Congress all of a sudden woke up one morning and invented for the first time. This is something that the intelligence agencies have been very careful about making sure they try to respect over the course, certainly since the 1970s. I won't go beyond the 1970s. But you know, historically, remember the 1970s were the Church and Pike Committee hearings, examined the intelligence abuses of that era, and as a result, a number of intelligence reforms were taken. I recently was at I think it's the 40th anniversary of the Church Committee, an advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. It's actually the Brennan Center, which I guess is headquartered in New York, but they held a commemorative event remembering the Church Committee, and they brought in legislative folks who had been on the committee to speak. And I was also there to speak, and I was able to reassure them that we still teach the lessons learned from the Church Committee, even this many years later. So that's a little bit about where I fit in the overall framework of things. To better understand how my job functions and how it is that we protect civil liberties and privacy in the community, I think I have to also describe for you a little bit what I call the rules and oversight framework that we operate under. So if you just give me a few minutes to go over that. One of the things that is very important that will happen if any of you ever join an intelligence community element, or actually any agency in government, is that you'll take an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And I carry, if I can find it without disrupting the mic, this is the same one I've been carrying for 10 years, the 10 years that I've been in this job, the Constitution in my pocket. I actually do read it every now and then, although I don't provide any guidance strictly from a plain reading of the text of the Constitution, knowing all the jurisprudence that has gone on, but it's really a symbolic reminder to myself that this is what we're here to support and defend. And I hand out pocket constitutions every Constitution Day, September 17th, to the entire workforce at the ODNI. We put up posters and banners. We have an event. Again, we remind folks that we're here to support the Constitution and all that it stands for and all that it means. One of the challenges that we face in figuring out what the rules should be and how to oversee compliance with those rules is that we're inherently operating as a secret intelligence service. We have to operate in secret in order to be effective. As I like to say, a fully transparent intelligence service would be a fully ineffective one. So you have to keep secrets in order to be effective if you want to have an intelligence service. But we're also operating in a public and increasingly transparent democracy. So how do we do both? How do you operate in secret while also providing adequate transparency for public trust and accountability? I think that's a huge challenge and one that's become much more evident to all of us in the last couple of years. The rules and oversight framework that we've traditionally operated under, certainly since the Church Committee, so it includes the Constitution and our oath to the Constitution, of course, but then it gets into a lot more detail, some of it very complicated and difficult to sort through. But we obviously have certain statutes that are key for providing us a regulatory framework for what we do. I'm sure you're very familiar and have had discussions about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. I'll go into more detail on that act if people want to hear more questions about it. Particularly, there were 2 programs that were authorized under that act that became the subject of a great deal of public discussion. The telephony metadata program under Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which amended a section of FISA, and Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act itself was modernized in 2008, and otherwise it's been with us since 1978. So again, an outgrowth of the Church Committee. And under that act, just very briefly, the reason it's so important is because if you're an American or a permanent resident or a U.S. company or an association substantially composed of Americans or permanent residents, then under that act, in order to conduct surveillance on the communications of that individual, we need an individualized court order with a probable cause finding by the judge. So that if we're targeting a particular American for surveillance, no matter where that American is around the world, we need a court order, individualized, demonstrating probable cause to believe that the American is an agent of an international terrorist organization or another foreign power, and is consciously and intentionally acting to further the goals of that power. The other concern with conducting surveillance are communications that target may have with Americans. So even if I'm focusing on a particular, say is a terrorist target overseas, that person may have communications with Americans. Some of them may be entirely innocent of any complicity with what that person is up to. We call those incidentally intercepted communications, and under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, we also have strict rules we call minimization procedures governing how we can handle those intercepted communications. So I can talk a little bit more about that, and also I will mention that there's been, of course, recent changes to the law in the last year. Another major set of rules that we follow is Executive Order 12333. So we call it 12333. This executive order was one that was put in place, again, post-Church Committee in 1980, 81. And in fact, President Ford initially put one in place in 76, and President Carter put one in place, and then ultimately President Reagan replaced those with 12333. It was then updated in 2008, and it still retained the 12333 number because we were all very familiar with it. We didn't want to change it. That's basically why it still has 12333, even though it got a major revision. Under that executive order, in the first part, it lays out what each intelligence agency is authorized to do, and in the second part, it puts in place restrictions on intelligence activities, primarily around U.S. person information, collection, retention, and dissemination. What are the reasons we can do it? Who can do what, and under what circumstances? So this is further fleshed out in Attorney General guidelines. Those are all now public, including recently CIA made theirs public as well. They're on their website. And actually, we need to do a better job of publicizing these Attorney General guidelines. So these are rules that essentially get into another level of detail regarding what we can and can't do under Executive Order 12333. And we need to do a better job of getting them all in one place and so that they're very easily accessible by everybody. And I can talk about the challenges of doing that. So that's a little bit of a high-level insight into the rules. And then we have a lot of oversight. I call it a framework of many layers with many players. I'm one of the folks that is part of that oversight framework. We have civil liberties and privacy offices that are now popping up inside the intelligence community. NSA had a very public creation of an office, so I have a counterpart at NSA. They have a civil liberties and privacy officer, and she has her own staff. She reports directly to their director. One of the things that sometimes gets confusing is people say, are you part of the lawyers? You know, I am a lawyer, but I'm not part of the lawyers. Are you part of the Inspector General community, the guys who go in and do investigations and audits? And the answer is no to both. We're an independent office within our organizations, and our job is to bring a policy perspective, putting forward the privacy and civil liberties viewpoint as new activities are being conducted and as we oversee existing activities. So these agencies have these folks in place. We have a lot of lawyers, so if you haven't learned that already, there's more lawyers than people in this country, and it seems to me sometimes there are more lawyers than officers in the intelligence community. But that's a good thing. I'm a lawyer, so I'm all in favor of that, except when they start arguing too much. We also have other agencies that conduct oversight. Department of Justice, a department of lawyers, carefully works with the intelligence agencies to provide legal advice and also to conduct oversight in terms of how we implement authorities, particularly court orders issued by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. We work very closely with the Department of Justice lawyers to go on visits to the agencies, see what it is that they're doing, look at the audit records, and make sure they're adequately complying with the court orders that are in place and with other legal requirements. We have recently, for Section 702, recently meaning in the last couple of years, been publishing our semi-annual assessments that we write together with the Justice Department. So there are 4 such reports that are currently on our website. 3 of them are quite significantly redacted because they were written and published before the recent transparency efforts in the last couple of years. The 4th one is less redacted, and in the future, for the ones coming out, we hope to make them much more readable and understandable without as many redactions. We also have an entity called the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board that conducts oversight over counterterrorism-related activities. And so I don't know how many of you are familiar with the existence of that board. We work very, very closely with it. It's an independent agency in the executive branch. It's a board. It actually is a board of 5 members. There's a full-time chairman and 4 part-time members who have other jobs, and they just come in on a part-time basis, so they still retain that external perspective, bringing it to the government. This is an effort to avoid sort of this notion of capture by the agency that you're regulating if you have these folks from outside government. They have a very significant staff. They're all fully cleared. They operated in a facility that's appropriate to review classified information. They have classified computer systems. And they've conducted 2 very detailed, in-depth studies of our activities that they have published. One of them was on the Section 215 program that I mentioned earlier, the telephony metadata program that we call, as we call it, and the other one is on the Section 702 program. We work very closely with them to make sure that those documents could be written in an unclassified manner. They are both very detailed, very comprehensive descriptions of those activities. The board found that the 215 program, it did not agree with. It felt like it was inconsistent with the statute, and it felt like we had failed to demonstrate to the board that it was a valuable program. That was an influential report, and Congress, as you know, has ultimately acted and issued what is known as the USA Freedom Act, and under that statute that calls for an end to that program. The president had already announced that he wanted to end the program, but he was looking for a way to transition it, and we felt we needed to have the law amended in order to transition out of the program. And I'll talk about more of that if people want. Another aspect of the USA Freedom Act, well, let me just finish with the board. So we work very closely with the board. They're now conducting a review on Executive Order 12333, a couple of the activities under that executive order that are conducted overseas by the intelligence agencies. We, of course, are subject to congressional oversight. Again, another outgrowth of the Church Committee hearings in 1980. 2 intelligence oversight committees were stood up within Congress, one in the House and one in the Senate. And we still work very closely with those committees. They get access to classified information. I sometimes hear complaints, sometimes from members of Congress and from others, that this oversight is not effective, that they are somehow letting all kinds of things go by them. I will not speak for Congress. If they don't feel like their own oversight is effective or not, I'm not going to speak about that. I can just tell you from my perspective, it feels very effective to me. They conduct line item, granular oversight over the activities of the intelligence community. We provide them an enormous amount of information, reports, briefings, testimony. Members of the intelligence community are up on the Hill just about every single day they're in session, and even when they're out of session, we'll be meeting with staff members from the oversight committees. They do get into an incredible, in my view, level of detail, which to me is reassuring in terms of them exercising their responsibilities carefully. And finally, we have the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. So we're talking about all 3 branches of government having different oversight responsibilities. So sometimes I've heard for many years, and I think some people are still saying this, that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is a rubber stamp. So this is a court of regular district court judges who serve on a rotating basis and hear applications for orders to be issued under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Do we have probable cause to believe this person is an agent of a foreign power? Or are these procedures, do they meet all the legal requirements under the Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act? That's the other one that they look at. They also look at compliance incidents. If we note an incident of noncompliance with a court order, we report it to the court immediately. For significant ones, they want it immediately. For others, we can roll them up into a quarterly report. And of course, they can issue remedial orders and directions, and as an Article III court, we must follow those orders. So this is, in my view, not a rubber stamp. They have a whole process, which they have now been much more transparent about, in which they go back and forth with government lawyers and question the applications that are put in front of them. And if the application is one that they have serious concerns about, typically it gets withdrawn, or it gets narrowed or changed in a way that now passes muster and meets their objections. This is the way that the government has been dealing with the court. The court has written, judges have written public letters to explain their role and to explain this back and forth process, so this is now a matter of public record. And one of the things that they have talked about in terms of concerns regarding reforms is the duty of candor. They have pointed out that the government has been very candid with the court. We come forward with any issues or problems that we have. Sometimes they chastise us for not coming forward to them more quickly. I feel that sometimes they don't understand that a government takes time to do anything. It takes me 3 weeks to set up a meeting, but notwithstanding that, I think we need to do things more quickly to the extent we can. The reason I bring all that up is because one of the changes in the USA Freedom Act was to introduce this concept of an amicus. Now, of course, the court could always have appointed an amicus as an Article III court, a friend of the court to come in and brief a topic of interest. Congress has now required that they set up a panel of cleared lawyers to do this. I believe that the number is 5 that they set up in the USA Freedom Act. There's already been a public announcement that one of them, that an amicus has been named in one case. I think this is a good thing. I think it's going to be helpful to present the court with alternative viewpoints. I look forward to seeing how it works out. I mean, we don't know exactly how the practical details of it will play themselves out over time. But generally speaking, to have more views presented on any topic, I think is helpful. I don't think it's fair to the court to suggest that without the amicus, they were acting as a rubber stamp. If you are in a position of receiving an argument and you know there isn't another side and you know you take seriously your responsibilities, you and your staff will raise those other issues that you see from the documentation. I think the court was playing that role very, very scrupulously. That's not to say that somebody completely from outside the system coming in and looking wouldn't raise very good and important issues, and so I think that's going to be helpful. So we have all these rules, we have all this oversight, so sometimes people say, well, Alex, so what's the big deal then? Why is it that we've been through such a time of turmoil for the intelligence community in the past couple of years if everything you're doing is so perfect? Well, I don't think everything we're doing is perfect. There are issues that we're all dealing with and that we have to do better in terms of how we address them. I have always felt that this is a robust framework of rules and oversight for intelligence agencies. So I have always felt very confident that we are doing our best to do the right thing. I have not seen rogue individuals or rogue agencies who are consciously trying to do the wrong thing in terms of how we would all in this room, I think, agree on what the wrong thing is and what the right thing is. They've always tried very carefully to understand what the rules are and to follow those rules. I think what we have seen in the last couple of years, though, are serious questions being asked about whether we're following the right rules and whether there are other changes that we need to make in order to give the public greater confidence that these rules are being interpreted and applied in a way that they're comfortable with. So this gets me to the topic of transparency. You can change the rules, and we have been changing the rules. I just mentioned the USA Freedom Act and changing the 215 telephony metadata program. You can also change how the oversight works. You can give more staff to an oversight entity like the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. We also have other oversight entities, so if anyone is from another oversight entity, I didn't mention you, I apologize. but there's other oversight entities like the Intelligence Oversight Board. You can add an amicus to the FISA court process. So again, you're changing some of these oversight functions, how these rules are developed. But at the end of the day, is it going to affect the trust that the public has in our activities? And I think, if you think about all the slogans that we have around trust, right? Trust but verify, show me, I'll believe it when I see it. Well, guess what? In the intelligence community, we haven't been able to show you everything that we do for the reasons that I mentioned earlier on, which is we need to be able to keep secrets in order to remain effective. The question is, can we draw that circle around the secret a little bit more tightly? Right now it's drawn rather broadly. There are good reasons for drawing a circle around a secret very broadly. I'll just quickly use my fist to illustrate it. If that's the secret, and this is the information around the secret, if I reveal all the information around the secret, except for the secret, particularly sophisticated adversaries will be able to infer what that secret is, which argues for drawing the circle around the secret a little bit more broadly. And in fact, the courts have recognized what they call the GLOMAR defense to Freedom of Information Act litigation. I can either confirm or deny a whole range of activities in order to maintain the secret on the one activity that actually is secret. You can refuse to answer questions regarding a range of activities. Otherwise, people could just, by asking questions, infer what the secret is. That concern is still very much with us, but I think that there are ways that we can be more transparent. I think we've proven that over the last couple of years. We've done an enormous amount of work to declassify and release documents about particularly the programs that have been of interest to the American public. There's something called IC on the Record, which is a Tumblr platform. I didn't know what Tumblr was until I found out about this, but I obviously have to get with it. We have published over 5,000 pages, it costs well over $5,000, 5,000 pages of declassified and officially released documents on IC on the Record. So there's an enormous amount of information about our programs there. As I mentioned before, we worked very closely with the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board to make sure they could write a very detailed, comprehensive description of the activities we're conducting under 2 programs. There are no redactions in their reports. We worked very hard to make sure that that level of specificity, which would have been unheard of a few years ago, is now available to the public. So we've done a lot in making things public. We want to do more. So on your tables, you'll see the principles of intelligence transparency. These were published in February of this year. And basically, there are 4 principles. I'll just go over them this way. It's the what of intelligence transparency. That's the first. What are we going to be transparent about? What is the content that we are talking about here? Well, it's very broad. If you look at that principle, it's broad. But the key thing is that it's not just the rules and oversight framework that I was just talking about. It's also our mission, our activities, and our capabilities. That gets to the heart of what it is that we need to keep secret to be effective, but I also think that gets to the heart of what the public needs to know more about in order to have more trust in what we do. That's going to be difficult to accomplish, but we are going to work hard at that what to make sure that we can be more broadly transparent than what we have been in the past. The second principle I think of is the how. How are we going to do it? So one issue that you'll find if you go up on IC on the Record now, especially if you go to some of the earlier documents that were released, is that they're very technical documents. They're released in large tranches. They've got redactions in them. And you have to basically have been a student, which many of you are, a student of this area in order to go through those things and understand what we're trying to say. We've tried to help the more general reader understand it by publishing summaries that come in front of the document, so you don't have to read the whole document. You can look at the summary to get a gist of it. Because we're so concerned about being accurate and true to the content so that we don't misstate something in a summary and get accused of misleading the public, those summaries can be also difficult to understand, very technically written, written by lawyers who are trying to be as accurate as possible while still being brief. The end result is that this is enormously important transparency, but it hasn't really had a sea change in terms of public understanding, I don't think, yet. We have to do more. We have to get on social media. Social media is something that the intelligence community is starting to sort of dip its toe in the water on, but we have to do better. That's where much of the public is right now and gets a lot of their information, their leads for more information. We've got to get on there as well. We've done some social media, but we need to do more. I talk to advocacy groups quite a bit. I just met with with a dozen or so organizations a couple of days ago. So we have to have a more structured and routine process for meeting with we call it civil society, with the advocacy organizations, and get into a battle rhythm where that's part of the routine for the intelligence community. Then the third principle, I call it, if the first is the what, the second is the how, the third is but still we're protecting sources and methods. That's a core part of what we do as an intelligence community. We protect the secrets that we need to keep secret to be effective. I've said that 3 times now or so. But if you look at the detail of that principle, you'll see that it highlights aspects of our current classification guidance that can be leveraged to improve transparency. We're only supposed to classify what truly is a national security secret. So overclassification is not something that we should be doing on a routine basis. We should be carefully marking the information so that some of it may be classified, some of it may be unclassified. We should be writing things to the lower classification possible. We have published guidance on tear lines. We have published guidance, we call it tear lines. So like there's a classified part that is essentially an unclassified appendix, or an unclassified body and a classified appendix, more likely, in how we do things. So we can leverage all of that guidance to better effect. And then finally, the fourth principle says basically do it. And so we're in the middle of that phase right now. These were published in February. We've been hard at work coming up with an implementation plan. We wrote that implementation plan to be a public document. As soon as it gets finally approved by our leadership, that will also be released and published. And we'll outline some initiatives that we plan on taking to implement to make this all a reality. The key here is to try to make it sustainable and an institutional part of the IC. No one pretends that that'll be an easy job. There are cultural challenges we have to overcome and very real risks that we have to mitigate. So that's what I wanted to talk about, is sort of who I am, how I fit into the rules and oversight framework, and the work on transparency that I think we still have to do. And I'll stop talking now and take questions.
All right. Well, that was extremely interesting. Alex, thank you for sharing that overview with us. I know we have a lot of people who came in already with some questions, and probably many more that were spurred by your comments. So just open the floor, and if you're interested, Alex will call on you as your hands go up. Not everybody all at once.
Yeah.
So, I guess the amount of information that you can retrieve about U.S. nationals as opposed to non-U.S. nationals certainly tends to differ because of, let's say, co-browsers and so on. And it seems as if part of how that restriction comes into play is when, say, U.S. nationals may be engaged in international terrorism. However, let's say with the growing number of instances of domestic terrorism, do you see any of those policies changing or requiring any adaptations?
So I'm glad you brought up the distinction between U.S. nationals and nationals, because I'd meant to go through that. I'll get to your question in a second, but basically, when the president gave his speech in January of 2014, he also announced changes that we were going to make in our policies to make it more explicitly how we will protect the information of non-U.S. nationals. So we use the term U.S. person because it's a legal person, so it includes a U.S. corporation and a U.S. association, basically, as well as citizens and permanent residents. So then we just sort of shorthand it and say the non-U.S. persons, everyone else. It's not like it's a free-for-all on everybody's data. It is not. We don't do this indiscriminately. We do it pursuant to lawful intelligence purposes, looking for specific foreign intelligence that respond to the national intelligence priorities. And we treat personal information in our analytic products, regardless of nationality. We treat it consistently in terms of making sure that it can only be included if we are satisfied it meets our data quality standards, that it's as accurate as we feel it can be made given the nature of intelligence, and that it's necessary to include that information for the purposes of that intelligence product. The President announced in January of 2014 Presidential Policy Directive 28. I think you said you were working on that, and others have also been, of course, in this group. I'm sure you guys are studying that. So we have published the policies of the agencies in implementing Presidential Policy Directive 28. And there's a lot of things. There's a lot in that Presidential Policy Directive. The first part talks about general principles. We're not going to do things to burden dissent. or based on somebody's religion or ethnicity, or race, or gender, or sexual orientation. I think I got the right categories there. We also don't do industrial espionage. We don't steal trade secrets from other countries' companies and give them to our companies for their commercial advantage. That's how we define it, and we don't do that. And so that's in that first principle. It also talks about tailoring our activities as much as feasible. And by tailoring, we mean making sure that they are reasonably required in order to accomplish the purpose that we're trying to accomplish, and that they're not broader or more intrusive than necessary to accomplish the purpose. That's generally what we mean by tailoring. So, and then if you look at part 2, there are limits placed on the use of signals intelligence, communications, interceptions, signals intelligence information that is collected in bulk. So we limit that to only 6 authorized purposes. In part 3 is a part that people often don't focus on, which is a section requiring policymaker involvement to assess risks involved with signals intelligence collection. And then part 4 talks about us having equivalent protections to the extent feasible in terms of how we retain and disseminate information as between U.S. person and non-U.S. person information. So there are these measures that we've taken. I know that other countries, some governing bodies in other countries would like us to do more than what we've already said we're doing under Presidential Policy Directive 28. We are working on that and trying to figure out how else we can go about meeting people's concerns. Regarding domestic terrorists, so the rules are still the same. And in particular, if you're operating inside the United States, you need to have probable cause before you can do anything intrusive, like a search or a seizure or a surveillance of somebody in the United States, really regardless of nationality. What we have focused on from an intelligence community perspective, so there's a law enforcement side, and then there's the intelligence side. And from an intelligence side, we're looking to see to what extent is somebody inside the United States acting to further the goals of a foreign terrorist organization. Has he been virtually recruited through the web, through internet materials? Is he actively carrying out planning to commit violence in order to further the goals of a foreign terrorist organization, or acting on the instructions that are been fed to him either directly or indirectly on a website? So those are the kinds of things we look to make sure that the intelligence community is appropriately focusing on somebody inside the United States. We still maintain that division in the intelligence community. We're focused on foreign threats to the nation, and not on law enforcement activities, local crimes and that kind of a thing. So it gets a little challenging in the area of terrorist acting in terms of the whole countering violent extremism area inside the United States. But it's an area that we've been looking at very carefully. Yes?
As the intelligence community increases its utilization of open source intelligence, do you foresee any new privacy concerns, particularly when it's pretty difficult to immediately ascertain citizenship or position of someone, say, on Twitter or Instagram or something like that?
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. Yes, we actually published in 2011 guidance on how to properly obtain and use publicly available information. And in that guidance, we basically asked the question, if it's public, how can it be private? And although you can't, once you put something out in a deliberately public way, not that someone else has posted about you, but you have knowingly made the choice to put something out to the general public, it does become a hard question to know, well, to what extent should intelligence agencies be more restricted than any general member of the public, than any terrorist organization, than an intelligence service of another country from looking at that information? But we do restrict ourselves. So, for example, one thing that we can't do is act based on the expression of First Amendment protected speech. So if somebody's engaging in First Amendment protected speech in social media, that's not a reason for us to look into it. Another restriction we put on ourselves, it's really a manifestation of how the various rules I've talked about apply in that area, is you have to have a very specific mission requirement for that information. In other words, just because my neighbor's information is online, I can't take my neighbor's information and stick it in an intelligence file and disseminate it as intelligence reporting, because there's a stigmatizing effect to it. And that's just not appropriate, so you can't do that. On the other hand, if there's terrorists who are active in social media trying to recruit people inside the United States to join their cause, and it's publicly available and everyone else is looking at it, then we have a mission justification for looking at that information, and we do. I think the technology changes so fast. One of the things that we tell our people to watch out for is to really ask themselves, to what extent is this truly public? Like, you're not circumventing a privacy setting. You need to make sure that the person who put it out there, is putting it out there so that it's accessible to any member of the general public. At that point, it becomes publicly available. But I think that those challenges are going to keep getting more complicated and difficult as technology continues to change. So one of the things that I hear people talk about is like, well, we need a whole new set of rules for each new kinds of technology. And I have not been a believer in that, although I could be persuaded otherwise, because technology changes so rapidly that it's impossible for lawyers and policymakers to keep up. First of all, we have to agree on what the technology is, and we have a technology, I think it's called technology translation error, where the technologists understand what they're doing, but in explaining it to us, something gets lost in translation. We get it wrong, we think it's something else. And then it takes us about 2 or 3 years to agree on what the rule ought to be for that particular application. And by that point, the technology's moved on. So we have this great thing that we've announced for something that's no longer, for fax machines, and that's no longer something people use. Yes, sir. So for profiling, a really good source for that, the Department of Justice recently issued a really good document updating their profiling guidance, and I wish I could remember it's a long title. I think it's we used to call it the use of race guidance, but it applies to more than race. It basically, just to thumbnail it, you can't base something solely on someone, you can't use stereotypes, and you can't base an activity solely on someone's race, religion, ethnicity, gender identity, or sexual preference. The document, but that's not to say that it's not relevant. It can be relevant to a particular situation. So for example, in the law enforcement context, we have a tip that a person of a particular ethnicity committed a crime. Here's the ethnicity, here is the physical description of the suspect. Then it's part of what, a BOLO, a be on the lookout description. That's just an easy example. There may be, a terrorist cell operating in a particular country, so obviously we're looking at nationals from that country who may be trying to enter the United States. In those situations, yes. But just based on someone's religion, well, this person is of a particular religion, and therefore I suspect that he may be susceptible to the violent extremist narrative, that's not enough. And so we try to make sure that that's very clear to folks. And it's also bad from an Intel perspective. Intel is trying to get the right answer, is trying to get the best answer based on the information available, and stereotyping never leads to the best answer. And so the analysts are fully on board with that. Yeah.
I was hoping you might expand a little bit on the oversight process that happens in the private court. I'm kind of curious about some of the logistics. Like, for example, I think you mentioned they were district judges who were serving
Right.
in the court. Are they effectively given clearance for every piece of, every act that they're about to, adjudicate, or is each quantum of data that they're given sort of cultivated, and what sort of aspects of data are they given visibility to? Essentially, what I want to understand is these are people who are going to straddle the line between the public and the intelligence community. How do we make sure that they, don't sink too deep into one area or the other?
I'm not aware of anything that's withheld from the FISA court for classification reasons. I mean, it's possible, I guess, you might come up with a very sensitive, compartmented situation where that might be the case, but I just, in my 10 years, and then, my prior time at CIA, I'm not aware of any time where information was withheld for classification. So, I don't know. I mean, I don't want to speak too broadly. It's possible there have been some situations where, again, it's a very sensitive and compartmented thing that, even if it were that, I would imagine there would be an effort to make sure that the judge has enough information to make his decision. But I've never encountered that. So the judges are, receive all the information. Their staff is cleared. They operate in a secure facility. same as with the other oversight entities that I was talking about. There will be an effort in preparing the applications and the briefs not to present information that seems beyond the scope of whatever is legally relevant to what's in front of the court. So if there's a name of a particular human source, as an example, perhaps the most sensitive information that we could have to protect the life of that source, it wouldn't be included in legal documents. It's just the case doesn't need it, and so you're going to protect the name of the source. Yeah.
As a historical matter, one of the things that's been a great advantage for the USIC has been the cooperation, the willing cooperation of American corporations, especially involved in telecommunications. AT&T, Western Union, various others, not wanting to be public about it, but there's been a lot of cooperation. It's been very helpful. Some say that we've had a sea change, even before Snowden came along and catalyzed it further. There's, with the emergence of all sorts of new telecommunication technologies and different perspectives from the people and different backgrounds from the people who are becoming the CEOs and such in those companies. Do you see that? I mean, are we experiencing sort of a loss of a sort of corporate government partnership that used to be a home field advantage for the USIC, and is that slipping away in a permanent way? Is that inevitable, or is it even happening?
So I guess what I would say is, in my experience, which isn't necessarily representative of everyone else, if everyone's in this area, what I see happening is, I feel like, with some exceptions, companies typically prefer to get court orders rather than being asked to voluntarily provide something. So they are now much more, I would say, vocally and publicly demanding that they be served with court orders before they provide information, I think. But that's not a sea change. That, to me, is a logical part of what it means to be a corporation in today's world. What I think has been talked about publicly quite a bit is that they're taking other measures that they think are consistent with what their customers want, that make the jobs of the intelligence agencies much more difficult. So we talked about this going dark thing where companies are now providing automatic end-to-end encryption where they don't have the ability to decrypt the communication. Even if they get a court order for that particular communication, they're simply not going to have the ability to do that. And I do see that as a reaction to the climate that we're currently in. And of course they're doing that because I think they've talked about this, because they view it as a commercial requirement that they have to operate going forward. And so one hope we have is, with the transparency that we want to continue to do and do more of, is to kind of change that public discussion and make sure that people understand we have all these rules, we have all this oversight, and we're focused on doing our mission, which is to keep the nation safe and our allies safe as well. And I think if we get into a broader global discussion, that will also help, because some of what I think the companies are reacting to is the climate in other countries. And part of the problem that we've had with that conversation is that it tends to be somewhat focused on the US and not focused on what intelligence agencies do as a general matter around the world. It's not like the US is some outlier doing crazy things. The intelligence agencies, as you guys have studied in your classes, all do similar kinds of things, and they're aimed at, and they have similar aims. And particularly if you're an intelligence agency in a democracy, we all face very similar challenges. We go about meeting those challenges in ways that are unique to our, in my experience, what I've seen, that are unique to our culture, our history, our current priorities, and particularly our legal framework. So if you're in Europe and you're subject to a parliamentary system, they don't have Congress as a separate branch of government, but they will have parliamentary oversight committees with varying degrees of intrusive oversight over their intelligence agencies. That's a fact of life over there. We've heard a lot about the EU, the European Union, and their concerns about American intelligence activities. So it's important to note that the European Union governance framework itself does not have jurisdiction. They call it competence. Does not have competence over the intelligence activities of the member states of the European Union. So when the European Union talks about restricting intelligence, the only people they're really talking to at this point is us, as the United States. And that's all well and good. We're engaged in conversations. We know it's important to have those discussions with them and to explain how it is we do things and how we restrict ourselves. But I think it would have there would be a more balance in the overall discussion if it was broadened to the role of intelligence agencies in democracy as a general matter and not solely focused on the United States. Because there's some lack of balance there. There's the impression that we're the only ones doing any of this stuff. Yes?
So you talked about a public perception problem in the intelligence community, and I think that part of the problem is that when you have, or it seems to be that when you have leaks such as Snowden, that the leakers and then the agencies they work with can define the narrative about these programs, and then the IC is on the defensive. Recently, in an interview or a talk with Steve Cole, we asked him about this, and he said that these types of leaks are important and necessary in order to check the behaviors of the intelligence community, because anybody who works in the intelligence community, I'm quoting him here, will tell you that whistleblower protections are a complete joke. And I was wondering if you could give us a quick outline of those whistleblower protections and whether or not you concur with Mr. Cole on whether or not these are effective.
So I guess I'll go ahead and give you some of the legal background here. So in the intelligence community, the whistleblower has a particular definition. So to be a whistleblower in the intelligence community means you're using authorized channels to bring a matter up, because we do not believe that any individual is empowered on his or her own to go public with something. There's a way to bring the information to go through appropriate channels. Just to use the most blatant example, hypothetical to make my point, if I don't like the way a particular intelligence source in a hostile country is being handled, I can't take my issue to the New York Times and tell the New York Times the name of that source and say that person needs to be treated better or something like that, because that could put that person's life at risk. So we don't give that. That's not what it means to be a whistleblower in our community. What it means to be a whistleblower is you go primarily through the Inspector General, which is a very independent body that has the direct reporting relationship to Congress. And if it's a matter of significant concern, they will make sure you get to Congress and raise your concern directly with Congress. And then there are protections against retaliation. We were just talking about there's a distinction between contractors and employees. For an employee, we're prohibited from taking an administrative or personnel action. For contractors, because they're not our employees, they're the employees of our contractor, the protections take the form of saying that you can't take adverse action on the person's security clearance. You can't fail to renew their clearance or take away their clearance in retaliation for them using whistleblower channels. So you hear a lot of anecdotal information around how those actually work in practice, and it's really hard. I haven't myself done a study of it. We all take it seriously, so I do think those are real protections. They exist. I know our Inspector General takes them very seriously, and if there's a claim of retaliation that an employee was retaliated against, he will investigate that. He'll put people under oath, and he'll take that extremely seriously. So it's against the law to retaliate against somebody who uses channels, and he will make sure that takes place. I have a complaint function that you heard Eric talk about when he introduced me. So I also have the ability to investigate complaints, and as part of a separate statute that covers my office, people are expressly protected from retaliation as well. I do think we can do more to explain to our workforce what those channels are, how do they go about making their complaints, and the fact that they're protected against retaliation. I know our ICIG is very focused on making sure that message gets out there. So I think we can do more, and that's part of what we plan on doing with this transparency work that we're going through here. Another thing that we were talking about earlier is that there is actually a mechanism for an employee to raise a concern about classification. So if you think something is too highly classified and you believe it should be subject to greater transparency, you can raise that. That's in the executive order that governs our classification, and request a declassification review of that information. And with that, my intent is to put more attention on that declassification review process to make sure it's streamlined and effective. And I guess the last thing is just an idea that we've been pursuing, and that I think we will be. I'm pretty sure we will be pursuing. There's a lot of regulations that I still have to go through in terms of making it a reality, but really to drive home the point that it is okay, in fact expected, to raise complaints and issues through authorized channels, to recognize people who do that with an award, a National Intelligence Award that recognizes somebody for effectuating change by going through authorized channels, and also by talking to that person's supervisor and recognizing, hopefully, the supervisor as well, who that person who enabled and supported someone. We want those concerns to be raised. We want people to use authorized channels, and so we really think this will be helpful in building that culture through. So I don't know what Steve's experiences, and there are whistleblower advocacy organizations that we meet with. They also raise a similar concern that at the sort of the ground level, that if somebody raises a complaint, the supervisor may do something that is a problem. So all I can say is if we're aware of it, we take it seriously, we investigate it, and we put a stop to it. I will tell you that the way that people come to me is not through that formal complaint function in the statute, but just calling me or stopping me in the hall or sending me an email and just making sure I'm aware of a particular issue or activity, and that's all I need. And then I always say I protect my sources and methods, and I will not put that person's name out there unless that person wants me to. Yes? Yes. Oh, that's a good question. What is the process? So the P Club is a new organization. They have 5 very independent members. They're independent at themselves as an agency, and we have worked very hard to stand them up. And one of the things I know they're working on is documenting those kinds of processes. So if you're interested, you can go to the P Club website, and when they finally announced, they initially announced an agenda for the 12333 review, and then they announced how they had scoped it down. And I think there were 4 separate statements issued by the 5 board members. I'm pretty sure there were 4 separate statements. So that'll give you an insight in terms of how they're currently doing it. My sense is that they take into account a lot of different factors. There's a discussion that goes among the board members, and they do feel like they need to be very transparent, and so they'll, in that one instance, they actually published statements of views in terms of how they ended up with that, with scoping it. So the problem with doing a 12333, yes, they do have access to the programs. The problem with doing a 12333 review is that 12333 is a very broad executive order. It governs the intelligence activities of all the intelligence agencies. So saying that you're going to do a 12333 review to the intelligence officers who heard it, to us, it sounded like you're going to review everything we do. There's 17 of us. We're doing all kinds of different things. Are you thinking about, what NGA does? Are you thinking about what DIA does? How about the uniformed services? What are you thinking? FBI? And then what of the FBI programs or CIA programs or NSA programs? So they acknowledged that it was too broad to just say a 12333 review. They went through their own process of hearing. They got overview briefings from the agencies, and from those briefings they have chosen they're choosing. I think they're still in the process of choosing which ones to do. So they're picking programs and activities. I think they announced that they're picking 4 total. 2 each from 2 agencies. And then those are the ones, so from our perspective, it's really important for an oversight entity, because one of the points I was making, it's not like you can keep adding oversight and oversight and oversight and have no impact on the operations of the intelligence agencies. The key people who respond to those oversight requests, who actually go in and brief the oversight folks, are the operators, the analysts, the leadership, and the people running that particular intelligence activity and program, or in the bowels of it. They've also met with analysts, at the working level. And any time, any hour, day, week that they spend on those things, they're not spending on their core mission. And we're not in an era of increasing budgets. We're in an era of tightening budgets. So you can't keep growing the demand side on oversight, and for me, I'm pushing transparency. It also requires subject matter experts to take a look at it to make sure we're only disclosing what can be safely disclosed, without having an impact on the supply side of the information. So the folks who are working the mission are being pulled in many different directions right now. So it's really important for us that, and I think the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board is doing this, is to figure out how to make sure that when they do come and ask for information, it's sort of prioritized in terms of what it is that they want. So we're doing a similar thing on the transparency principles. I've already met, like I alluded to earlier, with advocates. I want to meet with other folks. I already got some ideas here in terms of what are the topics that we should focus on. We have limited resources. What is something that we feel is in the public interest that would be very helpful to understanding the intelligence community and our intelligence activities, whether we're doing the right thing or the wrong thing? What is that area, generally speaking, that people feel we need to be more transparent about? The P Club is particularly helpful in that regard because they have access to the classified stuff. If you don't have access to the classified stuff, I understand it's hard for you to know what you don't know. But it's part of that process, like what's the priority? Yes, Steve.
You spoke in a good bit, including just now, on this delicate balancing between secrecy required to have an effective intelligence community and kind of openness and transparency required to have one that's accountable and engaged in appropriate activities within our form of government. One of the things that Director Brennan, including while he was here, has been speaking about, trying to help the public understand this, how critically dependent the U.S. intelligence community is on foreign partners. The fact that although we have a large workforce and highly capable technically and a global representation, we actually sit at the center of an incredibly complex web of like-minded services and governments that help us with information and all sorts of other tasks. So the question is, have you seen or do you have a systematic way of gauging how our foreign partners, upon whom we depend critically, feel about our move towards openness and transparency? They operate under entirely different domestic conditions. They know they give us an incredible amount of sensitive information, and they may be somewhat uncomfortable about where we're going with all this openness, particularly concerning the things they share with us. So have you encountered this?
So I can't get into detail. I can't be fully transparent on this matter, but I can say, generally speaking, there's a range of reactions. It depends on exactly what the factors you talked about. So some countries feel themselves to be in a very similar situation to ours. Others feel like this isn't really directly impacting them. What I have found in common, though, is a recognition that it's helpful to have a dialogue on this transparency effort. The folks who feel like they're in a similar position to the United States are very interested in what we're doing on transparency and learning from it. I think we've spent, like I said, a good year working this issue systematically within the intelligence community involving all of the 17 elements. So that's a really strong, solid, substantive head start. Other countries, I'll just mention the UK as an easy example. So the UK has recently gone through some significant degrees of transparency. They've had several reports, two major ones. Well, they cite three, but I've only read two, so I'll talk about two. Their Parliamentary Oversight Committee wrote a very detailed and I thought thoughtful report, and then David Anderson, who is their reviewer of terrorism legislation, he has some kind of title like that, wrote an extremely well-received public report on the activities of their intelligence agencies. Both of them are very detailed and long. If you're a student in this area and you haven't read those reports, I commend them to you. And the UK will be coming out with investigatory powers legislation at some point, based on David Anderson's recommendations, is my understanding. So they are dealing with the issue of transparency, and in David Anderson's report, one of the main things he calls for is greater transparency in the UK. Now, to what degree that then gets reflected in other countries and how they operate, I don't know, or I can't comment, but just I would say that we are very focused on that. I do expect to be traveling quite a bit more. I just got back from London, and before that I was in Barcelona. I won't be able to say that very much more frequently. Barcelona was just vacation. So we're taking it very seriously, and I think you're right to point out that people are going to have a range of reactions. I do think that I know that we can have a back and forth on this. I think my personal view, and of course I'm biased because I'm strongly in favor of this transparency initiative, is that it's here to stay. The public expectation for information has changed. Our workforce understanding of what it means to be an individual in today's society has also changed. They expect more transparency, more information. What I like to point out, this comes from our leadership who put it this way as well, which I thought was very appropriate. Protecting sources and methods remains an individual responsibility of every intelligence professional. Enhancing transparency is an institutional responsibility of the organization. So we need to find ways to enable our workforce to operate better in this transparent environment while still protecting secrets. So it could be very difficult. There are no magic bullet answers.
We've got a question over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So going back to the supply, demand, all the demand for the information, I guess really going back to preparing people in the IC, to advise on protection of civil liberties. Really going back to your experience when you were general counsel at CIA. Now you had a lot of experience in the private sector before you went into that.
Right.
So you probably, you had that advantage. But how prepared were you? How prepared were your counterparts to advise on these legal protections? And what does it look like now? How has it changed since then?
So it does take a lot of time and effort to get up to speed on that. So that's one of the issues that we have, and it's something that David Anderson recognized for the UK system. So whenever I see comparisons of our system versus other systems, I'm always struck by how similar the issues and challenges are. And the particular one is complexity. So the rules can be very, very complicated. And for a while, I thought, well, we're all very sophisticated grown-ups. We can deal with complexity. If we can't deal with complexity, we shouldn't be in charge of protecting the nation's security. But I'm starting to feel more and more that there's a limit to what the human brain can absorb and keep straight. And especially if you have to keep up with a lot of changes in the world, the rapid, increasingly rapid pace of change, it is important to figure out how to clarify this thing. So it's important to prepare somebody to understand all the complexities. You have to understand not only what the rules say, but how they've been interpreted, how they've been applied. You have to understand the intelligence activities that are being conducted. Each agency is itself a complicated organization. Many of them are nested within larger departments. So there's a lot to keep straight at any one time. I felt like I was pretty well prepared. And of course, I started at an Office General Counsel and got further training and preparation there before doing what I'm currently doing right now. When we get new people, we have to make sure that they get the right training and go through, and essentially they're mentored so that they can better understand how the rules work. And it also depends on your role. So if you're giving broad kind of advice on a range of issues, that's one thing. Some people have a very specific task. They have to make sure that something is being done in accordance with certain legal requirements, and so that can be a very straightforward process. So not everything is complicated. I will say that clarifying something can be very difficult. You have a whole decades worth of work on anyone who's looked at the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act knows that is not the most clearly written statute in existence. And the only thing harder than understanding it is simplifying it. Because when you try to simplify something, you always run the risk of unintended consequences. Like I didn't realize that by changing this word, it's going to have this downstream effect later, and that's not what we intended. So it's sort of the difference between the devil you know and the devil you don't. But that said, I do think simplification, clarification, those are very important goals, and we should try to get there. Yes, sir.
So your office sits within the ODNI and thus at the top of the intelligence community. And you've spoken about how there's other privacy and civil liberty offices within IC entities, including at NSA. And in addition, there's the General Counsel's offices who often handle questions about privacy and civil liberties, and even Inspector Generals who can handle complaints about possible abuses.
Correct.
So all of these entities, and all of them being lawyers and offices with certain amounts of staffs, have similar responsibilities and can handle similar questions. So how do the relationships between these offices operate in always keeping in mind mission effectiveness balanced with the protection of privacy and civil liberties?
Well, we have different roles to play. So the lawyers, of course, are lawyers, and they have to make sure they understand that the law is being followed, so they interpret the legal requirements. I'm a lawyer. I can tell whether they're doing something that I think is completely screwy, but I'm not the person who interprets the law officially for that agency. That's the general counsel in consultation with the Department of Justice. So that's the legal role, and they're supposed to, and they often do, but you know, it gets to be a blurred line sometimes. We'll distinguish legal advice from policy advice. They might say, well, this range of activities is permissible under that particular rule, but from a policy perspective, I think you'd better do this one. But it's not that that is the one that's legal and the other ones aren't legal. It's just that here's what the law allows, and from a policy perspective, I like this. So I operate in the policy sphere. So I want to know what's legal, and I want to hear what the lawyers have to say, and I work very closely with them. But again, having identified a range of activities, it goes back to what President Obama said in his speech. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should do something. So I'm there to argue from a policy perspective why it's important for us not to do this, but instead to do this. This is the best way to go, and so I'm bringing that up. I can also, I think we were talking about this earlier, because of my role, I certainly act as if I'm empowered to. I am empowered to raise difficult questions. I raise the questions that other people may not either think of raising or may feel a bit uncomfortable raising. It's my duty and my job to raise those questions, and so I raise them from privacy and civil liberties perspective. The IGs have a very defined set of rules and roles, and prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. They investigate, they do audits, they do inspections, and some of that can be very important from a civil liberties and privacy perspective to make sure the privacy rules are being followed, and to carry out special investigations that Congress may ask them to carry out in a very independent way with professional staff. So I think we each play our own roles. I think there is potential for overlap. I have always felt in my job that it's critical that I have very strong, trusted relationships with the General Counsel and with the Inspector General, and I do. So I think if I didn't, I think my job would be more difficult.
You did just kind of touch on this, but you mentioned that generally intelligence professionals are trying to do the right thing and follow the rules.
Right.
I was wondering, in your observations and your experience, both at the individual and the institutional levels, if doing the right thing is strictly defined by whether or not you're adhering to the law, or if kind of broader concepts of ethics and morality are also prominent in the discourse.
I think because of what I was talking about earlier, because the rules can get kind of complicated, so what would typically happen, I think, is I think if you're talking about the individual at the individual level, like there's a difference between how we figure out what the right policy choice is. So that's a more structured conversation, and I can raise a bunch of different kinds of issues from different perspectives. And I got to say, in almost every case, I'm not nearly the only person, raising those kinds of issues. It's a little hot here, so I'm sorry if I'm perspiring a little bit. Yes, I'm sweating. You got me sweating. Oh my God. But I think at the individual level, it's really that they can't quite articulate what it is about it. So we've had people, like I said, that informally contact my office, and they're bothered by something in a particular thing that they're working on, or that they saw. Actually, it's less frequently what they're personally working on because they understand it, they're comfortable with it, but more frequently what they saw someone else working on, like, I'm good, but that person, you should check them out. So, they hear something, they say, that doesn't sound right. Something sounds funny about that. And so they'll ask me to take a look at it. And what I have found is typically it sounded worse at first than it ended up actually being. So once someone will make, for example, in a briefing, a very broad statement that seems overly aggressive, over the top, problematic. And then maybe they have a PowerPoint slide that has that statement on there, because people like to read PowerPoint slides, that's how they present, right? So they'll put that PowerPoint slide out there, someone saw that, said, whoa, if they're doing that, that's a real problem. And I'll look at it, and we'll talk at it, and of course they're not doing that. That was just a poorly worded slide, and maybe they were being dramatic. I will say that I always tell people, don't be dramatic. You know, just, you know, you may be boring, but just be accurate. Just, you know, it's okay to be boring. So we've had this before. You know, the scientific community, I got to say, there was somebody who was scientist, anybody? You? Okay, from a tech perspective, there's some tech question that came to me. Anyway, in order to attract attention to their projects, I have found that some of our researchers like to be very dramatic in how they phrase what this new research project. This will enable us to identify a terrorist before he even realizes he's a terrorist. You know, sort of this Minority Report, you know, like, what? What is this, really? And then it's like, oh, well, we're going to be studying the, you know, sonar patterns and whale songs and hopefully the mathematical algorithm. And they're like, okay, say that. That's what you say. Because I don't know what this other thing is about. But, you know, you sort of fall into this pattern of being dramatic to attract attention and get funding. So.
Yeah.
Alex.
Steve.
Yeah, so we'll wrap it up now. Thank you very much, Alex, for joining us. Please join me in giving out a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great questions.